May 5th, 1945. The sound came first, a mechanical thunder rolling across the Bohemian hills. American tanks. At their head rode General George S. Patton, Jr., racing east faster than anyone thought possible. And 120 miles away, in a bunker beneath burning Berlin, Adolf Hitler received the news. Patton has reached Czechoslovakia. What followed wasn't a strategic response. It was a scream, primal, inhuman, the sound of a worldview shattering, because the Americans weren't supposed to be here. They weren't supposed to move this fast. They weren't supposed to be this strong, but they were. And in that scream echoing through the Führer bunker, the 1,000-year Reich died. This is the story of what Hitler screamed when Patton reached the Czech border first. The dawn came slowly over the Bohemian hills, reluctant, as if the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Mist clung to the cobblestones of Pilsen's ancient streets, like memory refusing to let go. The air smelled of wet earth and burning coal, tinged with something metallic, the residue of artillery fire that had rolled across these fields for days. In the distance, the rumble of engines grew louder, a mechanical thunder that made windows rattle in their frames and sent roosters into panicked chorus. The citizens who had hidden in their cellars for weeks pressed their ears against basement doors, listening to the sound that would define the next hour of their lives. American tanks rolling east. At the head of that column, commanding the spearhead of the Third Army, was General George S. Patton, Jr., a man who measured time not in hours, but in miles, conquered, who believed that speed was a weapon sharper than any bayonet. His face, weathered and angular beneath his polished helmet, bore the expression of a man who had been racing against something invisible his entire life. Behind him stretched a convoy of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks that seemed endless, a river of olive-drab steel flowing across the Czech countryside like the manifestation of American industrial might made flesh. The crews inside those vehicles were exhausted, their uniforms stiff with sweat and diesel, their eyes red from sleepless nights. But they were moving forward, always forward. 120 miles to the east, in a bunker buried beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler stood before a map table in the dim light of failing generators. The paper before him showed lines that no longer represented reality, divisions that had ceased to exist, armies that had dissolved into columns of surrendering men, borders that meant nothing anymore. His hands trembled, not from age alone, but from something deeper, a fury so complete it had begun to consume him from the inside. When the report came through, crackling over a field telephone carried by a breathless adjutant who had run through rubble-strewn streets to deliver it, the words hit Hitler like shrapnel. Patton has crossed into Czechoslovakia. He is approaching Pilsen. The Americans will reach the border zones within hours. What followed was not a strategic assessment. It was not a calm recalculation of forces or a measured response to battlefield developments. It was a scream, not the theatrical rage he sometimes performed for subordinacy, not the controlled fury of a leader rallying his men. This was something primal, a sound torn from the throat of a man watching the architecture of his entire worldview collapse in real time. Witnesses would later describe it as inhuman, a howl that echoed through the concrete corridors of the Führer bunker, like the cry of something dying. The words themselves were barely coherent. Fragments about betrayal, about destiny, about the Americans who were supposed to be soft, who were supposed to break, who were supposed to recognize the true enemy and join him against the Bolsheviks in the East. But they had not broken. They had not joined him. And now they were here, at the doorstep of what remained of his crumbling empire, led by a general who moved like a force of nature. To understand the depth of that scream, to grasp why Patton's arrival at the Czech border represented more than a tactical defeat, one must step back to the beginning of this collision between two visions of the world. The story does not start in May 1945. It starts 4 years earlier in the minds of German strategists who believed they understood America, who believed they had measured its soul and found it wanting. It starts in the briefing rooms of the Wehrmacht High Command, where intelligence officers compiled reports on American industrial capacity, yes, but also on American character, American will, American cohesion, what they saw or thought they saw, pleased them. America, they concluded, was a mongrel nation, a country of immigrants with no shared blood, no unifying heritage, no warrior tradition. Its military was small, its army ranked 18th in the world in 1939, smaller than Portugal's. Its soldiers were soft, raised in a culture of comfort and individual rights, where discipline meant negotiation rather than obedience. German officers read reports of American training camps where men complained about the food, where soldiers questioned orders, where the very concept of absolute authority was treated with suspicion. They read about labor strikes and political divisions, about isolationist movements and Hollywood fantasies. They saw a nation that produced jazz and comic books, not soldiers. A nation that would send its boys to war in Europe and watch them crumble when faced with veterans hardened by campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. This was not mere propaganda. This was genuine belief, rooted in the German military tradition that stretched back to Frederick the Great, a tradition that valued precision, hierarchy, and the willingness to die without question. American democracy, from this perspective, was weakness codified into law. How could an army function when every private believed he had the right to an opinion? How could men fight when they valued their individual lives above the collective mission? The German soldier was taught to see himself as part of a machine, one component in a greater mechanism of conquest. The American soldier, they believed, saw himself as a citizen in uniform, temporary, reluctant, counting the days until he could go home. When America entered the war in December 1941, German commanders did not panic. They made calculations. American industry would take time to mobilize. American troops would take time to train. American logistics would strain under the weight of supplying a two-ocean war. And when those troops finally arrived in Europe, they would face Wehrmacht divisions that had been perfecting the art of mechanized warfare for years. The outcome, German strategists believed, was predictable. America would bleed. America would negotiate. America would recognize that the real enemy was Soviet communism and step aside. But then came North Africa. Then came Sicily. Then came the beaches of Normandy and the hedgerows of France. And with each campaign, the German perception of American soldiers began to shift, not in the propaganda, which continued to depict them as cowards and gangsters, but in the field reports written by officers who had actually faced them. These reports told a different story. They described American artillery that could flatten entire defensive positions with terrifying accuracy, guided by forward observers who coordinated fire missions with a speed that seemed impossible. They described American logistics that kept entire armies supplied across hundreds of miles, that delivered hot food and ammunition and medical care with a regularity that German soldiers, accustomed to scavenging and making do, found almost supernatural. They described American air power that owned the skies so completely that German movement in daylight became suicidal. But more than the machines, more than the material, the reports began to note something unexpected about the American soldier himself. He was not, as predicted, soft. He was adaptable. Where German doctrine relied on executing plans with precision, American soldiers improvised, invented solutions, argued with their officers until a better idea emerged, and then executed it with a ferocity that caught Wehrmacht veterans off guard. They were not ideologues fighting for a 1,000-year empire. They were pragmatists fighting to finish the job and go home. And that, paradoxically, made them more dangerous. They had no romantic illusions about war. They approached it like a problem to be solved, with the same industrial efficiency their nation brought to manufacturing tanks and airplanes. By the spring of 1945, the illusion was completely shattered. The Americans were not coming slowly. They were not negotiating. They were not breaking. They were driving east with a speed that defied German expectations, and at the tip of that spear was GeorgePatton, a man who embodied everything the Germans had misunderstood about American character. Patton was not soft. He was not uncertain. He was a general who wore pearl-handled revolvers and wrote poetry, who quoted ancient military history and cursed like a dock worker, who demanded speed above all else because he understood that momentum was a psychological weapon as potent as artillery. His Third Army had broken out of Normandy, raced across France, and now, in the war's final days, was driving deep into Czechoslovakia, moving faster than supply lines could follow, faster than maps could be updated, faster than the collapsing German command structure could react. And the German soldiers who found themselves in Patton's path experienced a revelation that went beyond tactical defeat. They had expected to face an army. What they encountered was a civilization on wheels. When Third Army units overran German positions. The Wehrmacht soldiers who survived, hungry, exhausted, their uniforms in tatters, their vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel, stared in disbelief at what the Americans brought with them. Every American soldier seemed to have more equipment than an entire German squad. They had new boots. They had cigarettes, chocolate bars, tinned food in varieties German troops hadn't seen in years. They had trucks that ran, tanks that didn't break down every 50 miles, medical supplies that included penicillin, a miracle drug German soldiers had only heard rumors about. One German lieutenant, captured outside Pilsen on May 4th, would later describe his first encounter with an American field kitchen. His unit had been surviving on black bread and ersatz coffee for weeks, rationing every scrap. The Americans fed their prisoners hot stew, white bread, real coffee, with sugar. The lieutenant watched in stunned silence as GIs threw away half-eaten meals, lit cigarettes, and tossed them aside after a few puffs. Discarded clothing that was merely dirty, not even damaged. It was not the abundance itself that broke something inside him. It was the casualness of it. The way these American soldiers treated plenty as a normal condition of existence. This was not an army scraping together its last reserves for a final push. This was an army that could afford to waste because there was always more coming. The symbolic object that German soldiers latched onto, the thing that came to represent the unbridgeable gap between their world and the American one, was not a weapon. It was a can. Specifically, it was the C-ration, the tinned meal every American soldier carried. To a GI, it was barely food, something to choke down when nothing better was available, often traded or discarded in favor of local eggs or French wine. To a German soldier in 1945, it was treasure. The can itself was a marvel, factory-made, sealed, printed with labels and instructions. Inside was meat, real meat, along with crackers, candy, cigarettes, toilet paper, matches, everything packaged together, designed for one man, for one meal, produced in quantities so vast that America could feed millions of soldiers across multiple continents, while the folks back home barely noticed a shortage. German soldiers began hoarding these cans, not just for the food, but as objects of fascination. They represented a type of power that had nothing to do with tanks or aircraft, the power of an economy so robust it could afford to package individual meals in metal containers and ship them across an ocean. Officers tried to maintain morale by dismissing American material superiority as soulless, as a substitute for true warrior spirit. But the men who were eating bark and grass to survive knew better. Spirit did not stop artillery shells. Spirit did not heal wounds without medicine. Spirit did not move armies without fuel. The Americans had spirit. Anyone who fought them knew that, but they also had everything else. As Patton's tanks rolled toward the Czech border in early May, the strategic situation was clear to anyone with access to accurate information, which Hitler increasingly was not. The Third Reich was dead. Berlin was falling. The Soviets were flooding in from the east. The Western Allies were consolidating their hold on Germany. But in the chaos of those final days, one question remained unanswered. Where would the Americans stop? Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had made a strategic decision that would haunt post-war Europe. He would halt the Western advance roughly along the lines agreed upon with Stalin, allowing Soviet forces to take Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. But Patton disagreed violently with this decision. He believed with every fiber of his being that the Allies should drive as far east as possible, should take Prague, should establish a Western presence in Central Europe before the Soviets consolidated their grip. And so, in the first days of May, as the war entered its final hours, Patton pushed his forces beyond their designated stopping points, racing toward the Czech border with an urgency that went beyond mere military victory. He was not just trying to defeat Germany, he was trying to shape the post-war world, to plant the American flag as far east as possible before political decisions froze the map. His columns moved with reckless speed, bypassing pockets of resistance, ignoring flanks, living off captured supplies when their own logistics couldn't keep up. It was classic Patton, bold to the point of insubordination, driven by an instinct that the war would not truly end when Germany surrendered, that the real struggle was just beginning, and the line between East and West would matter for generations. When news of Patton's advance reached Hitler's bunker on May 5th, it arrived in a context of total collapse. The Führer's world had contracted to a few concrete rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery garden. The walls shook with the impact of Soviet artillery. The air smelled of mildew and unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke of burning documents. His remaining staff moved through the corridors like ghosts, maintaining the rituals of military hierarchy. even as the structure they served disintegrated. Reports came in sporadically, often contradictory, painting a picture of an empire in its death throes. But among all the catastrophic news, the fall of Munich, the surrender of German forces in Italy, the approach of Soviet tanks, it was the report of Patton's breakthrough that triggered Hitler's most visceral reaction. The scream that echoed through the bunker on that May morning was about more than territory lost. It was about vindication denied. Hitler had predicted that the Americans would recognize the Bolshevik threat and turn their weapons east, would see him as a bulwark against communism, and negotiate a separate peace. He had believed, even as his cities burned, that the fundamental incompatibility between American capitalism and Soviet collectivism would fracture the Allied coalition. He had expected the Americans to move slowly, cautiously, to worry about casualties and public opinion. Instead, they had come with Patton at the front, and Patton did not move cautiously. Patton moved like a man who understood that hesitation was defeat, who treated war as something to be won decisively and quickly, who led an army that reflected America's own character, pragmatic, impatient, overwhelming in its material power. The words Hitler screamed were recorded by multiple witnesses, though the exact phrasing varies in different accounts. What remains consistent is the content. Accusations of betrayal by his own generals, rage at the Americans for not recognizing their true enemy, fury at Patton specifically for moving like a barbarian. Without regard for the rules of military engagement or the strategic logic Hitler had convinced himself would govern the war's end. He ranted about the Americans reaching Czech territory before Soviet forces, as if this violated some cosmic order, some inevitability he had written into his conception of how history must unfold. His voice, already weakened by strain and medication, cracked as he hurled accusations at phantoms, at commanders who were dead or surrendered or simply gone, at a world that had refused to conform to his vision. What made the moment pathetic rather than merely dramatic was the disconnect between Hitler's rage and reality. He was screaming about strategic positions as if orders still mattered, as if the armies marked on his maps still existed, as if there was any possibility of containing Patton's advance. The Third Army was not coming slowly. They were already there. By the time Hitler's scream faded into the damp concrete silence of the bunker, American reconnaissance units had reached the outskirts of Pilsen, and Czech civilians were emerging from hiding, waving makeshift American flags sewn from memory, weeping with relief. The soldiers of Patton's Third Army who entered Pilsen that morning were not thinking about Hitler's reaction. Most were not thinking strategically at all. They were thinking about how close they were to the end, about going home, about surviving these last days, when to die would be a particularly bitter tragedy. But they could not help noticing the way the Czechs greeted them, not with the wary relief they had sometimes encountered in German towns, but with raw, desperate joy. People who had lived under Nazi occupation for 6 years, who had watched their country dismembered and their freedoms erased, who had survived in the shadow of camps and hangings and constant terror, emerged into streets still smoking from recent fighting to embrace American soldiers like liberators from a nightmare. The contrast was stark. Just miles away, German soldiers fleeing east to escape the Americans and surrender to them rather than face the Soviets moved in ragged columns, their faces blank with exhaustion and defeat. And between these two populations, the liberated and the defeated, rolled the American army, which seemed to belong to a different century, a different order of existence. The Americans had hot food and working radios and tanks that ran and medics with real medicine. They had maps and plans and a logistical network that stretched back across the Atlantic. They had an entire economy behind them, an economy that had not only armed them, but had armed the British and the Soviets and numerous resistance movements that had produced so much material. The problem was not scarcity, but distribution. Czech civilians who had been secretly listening to BBC broadcasts throughout the occupation had heard stories of American productivity, but seeing it was different. They watched American engineers throw bridges across rivers in hours, watch supply trucks arrive in endless convoys, watch soldiers discard equipment that seemed perfectly functional simply because something newer was available. An elderly Czech man in Pilsen, a veteran of the First World War, stood on a corner and watched an entire American armored division pass through the city. It took 11 hours. He counted the vehicles until he lost track, then simply stood and watched, shaking his head. Later, he would tell his grandchildren, it was not an army. It was a nation moving. This was what Hitler had miscalculated. This was what the German High Command, for all their professional expertise and battlefield experience, had failed to understand. America had not sent an army to Europe. It had sent a fraction of its productive capacity, a small percentage of its manpower, and it had been enough to help crush the Third Reich. The soldiers in those tanks were not supermen. They were farmers and mechanics and store clerks in uniform, many of them draftees who had never wanted to be soldiers at all. But they were backed by a system, economic, political, logistical, that could outproduce and outlast any opponent. The Wehrmacht had been a magnificent military machine, but America was an industrial civilization that could build military machines faster than they could be destroyed, and that difference had decided the war. For the German soldiers who surrendered to Patton's forces in those final days, the experience was transformative in ways they could not have anticipated. They had expected to be treated as the Americans treated everything, efficiently, quickly, with minimal fuss. They expected prison camps and interrogations and the formal process of defeat. What they did not expect was to be fed better as prisoners than they had been fed as soldiers. They did not expect American medics to treat German wounded with the same care as American wounded, to use precious supplies on enemies. They did not expect to be given cigarettes, to be allowed to keep photographs and personal items, to be addressed without the casual brutality that had been normalized in their own ranks. One young German corporal, 19 years old, captured near Pilsen on May 6th, sat in a temporary holding area, really just a field surrounded by wire, and ate his first American meal as a prisoner. It was nothing special. Canned stew, bread, coffee, a chocolate bar. He ate slowly, trying to make it last, and around him other German prisoners did the same, speaking in low voices, comparing notes. No one had been beaten. No one had been robbed of their possessions. The American guards stood watch with a boredom that suggested this was routine, that feeding and housing thousands of prisoners was just another logistical task to be completed efficiently. The corporal had grown up in the Hitler Youth, had been taught that Americans were degenerate mongrels, that German soldiers represented the pinnacle of military virtue. He finished his chocolate bar and stared at the wrapper, printed in English, with a brand name he could not pronounce, and felt something crack in the foundation of his beliefs. This was the psychological dimension of Patton's race to Czechoslovakia, the part that could not be measured in miles or captured positions. Every German soldier who surrendered to the Americans, every civilian who witnessed the Third Army's passage, carried away an understanding that would shape the post-war world. American power was not fragile. American democracy was not weak. The prosperity that produced those chocolate bars and C-rations was not propaganda. It was real, and it was backed by a system of government and economy that, for all its flaws and contradictions, worked so well it could fight a global war and raise living standards at home simultaneously. Worked so well its soldiers complained about the food, while German soldiers starved. Hitler's scream in the bunker was the sound of an ideology colliding with reality and shattering. He had built a worldview on the premise that strength came from racial purity, from authoritarian control, from the will to power unencumbered by democratic weakness. And he had been defeated by a mongrel nation of immigrants, by an army of civilians in uniform, by a system where power was checked and balanced and distributed rather than concentrated. The American soldiers who reached the Czech border first did not represent some master race. They represented something more dangerous to fascist ideology. They represented the possibility that free people, given the right system, could outperform slaves and fanatics every time. In the days following Patton's arrival at the Czech border, as German forces across Europe began surrendering en masse, the full scale of American material superiority became impossible to deny. Wehrmacht officers who had spent years fighting a war of scarcity, rationing fuel and ammunition, improvising repairs with salvaged parts, found themselves negotiating surrender terms with American counterparts, who seemed barely aware that logistics was supposed to be difficult. One German general, surrendering his corps to an American division commander, asked with genuine professional curiosity how the Americans had managed to keep their tanks fueled during such rapid advances. The American general shrugged and said they had fuel trucks, lots of fuel trucks, more fuel trucks than the German general had tanks in his entire corps. The conversation ended there, because what more was there to say? The Soviet forces approaching Prague from the east represented a different kind of power, vast, brutal, driven by ideology, and a thirst for vengeance that German atrocities in Russia had earned with blood. But the Americans approaching from the west represented something the Soviets could not match, a vision of peace that included prosperity, a system that produced abundance rather than merely redistributing scarcity. Czech civilians caught between the two advancing armies understood, in those May days, that their future would depend on which force reached them first. Those in Pilsen, in the American zone, wept with relief. Those further east, watching for Soviet tanks, felt hope mixed with fear. Patton himself, standing in the streets of Pilsen on May 6th, surveyed the city with satisfaction mixed with frustration. He had reached the border. His forces had penetrated deep into Czech territory, had liberated major cities, had positioned themselves to drive further east if allowed. But Eisenhower's orders were clear. Halt. Do not advance toward Prague. Leave that to the Soviets per the Yalta Agreement. Patton obeyed, but not happily. He understood what was being lost, what was being surrendered not to military necessity but to political calculation. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that the Red Army's advance into Central Europe was a problem that would haunt the West for decades, and that American forces had the capability to prevent it if given the freedom to act. The soldiers under his command, for the most part, did not share these strategic concerns. They were simply relieved the war was ending. They cleaned their weapons and wrote letters home and traded cigarettes for Czech beer and counted days until they might board ships for New York or San Francisco. They had done their job. They had crossed an ocean, fought through hedgerows and winter forests and river crossings and fortified towns, had watched friends die and kept moving forward, and now it was over. Germany was beaten. The victory was won. Whatever came next, whatever political arrangements the generals and politicians made, the men who had done the fighting just wanted to go home. But in that disconnect between Patton's strategic vision and his soldiers' desire for peace lay another American truth, one that Hitler had never understood. American military power was contingent. It was mobilized for specific purposes, applied with overwhelming force, and then, when the job was done, demobilized. The soldiers went home. The factories converted back to civilian production. The nation returned to its default state, which was not military but commercial, not authoritarian but chaotic with freedom. This was not weakness. It was choice. And it was a choice that could be unmade whenever necessary. Hitler had believed America's reluctance to fight meant America could not fight. He learned otherwise, but he died before learning the corollary, that America's return to peace did not mean America had forgotten how to fight, that the industrial and logistical capacity that produced those C-rations could be awakened again if threatened. The symbolic can, the C-ration that German soldiers hoarded and Czech civilians marveled at, became in those final days of the war a kind of ambassador for American civilization. It was not elegant. It was not beautiful. It was merely functional, reliable, mass-produced. It represented the same qualities as the tanks and trucks and airplanes, not craftsmanship, but engineering, not individual artistry, but systemic excellence. German weapons were often superior in design. Their tanks, better armored, their optics more precise. But America built 10 tanks for every one Germany built, and if 2 were destroyed, 8 remained. Quality could not overcome quantity when quantity was backed by quality, good enough. As the news of Germany's imminent surrender spread through Patton's Third Army, as soldiers began to relax and think about futures beyond the war, the men who had fought from Normandy to Czechoslovakia looked back on what they had accomplished with a mixture of pride and exhaustion and relief. They were not philosophers. They were not historians. Most of them did not think in terms of ideology or geopolitics, but they knew they had been part of something larger than themselves, something that mattered. They had helped destroy an evil that needed destroying, had liberated people who needed liberating, had proven that democratic societies could fight and win wars against totalitarian empires. Hitler's scream, echoing in the bunker, was the sound of that proof being delivered. It was the sound of a man who had gambled an entire nation, an entire continent, on a set of beliefs about race and power and destiny, and had lost. Lost not to some mythical Aryan rival, but to a diverse, messy, argumentative democracy that should have been weak and turned out to be strong. Lost not in a heroic final battle, but in a grinding, systematic destruction of his armies by an enemy that simply would not stop, would not quit, would not negotiate. An enemy that treated war like a job to be completed and then forgotten, that wanted nothing from Europe except to go home, that represented a kind of power Hitler's ideology had no vocabulary to describe. In the weeks that followed, as Germany formally surrendered and the occupation began, American soldiers spread across Central Europe, bringing with them not just military control, but a world view that would reshape the continent. They brought jazz music and baseball and democracy. They brought chewing gum and Coca-Cola and the idea that government should serve people rather than rule them. They brought an informality that shocked European class systems, a pragmatism that dismissed ancient feuds as irrelevant, a confidence that came from having never lost a war on their own soil. They were not perfect. American occupation had its share of abuses and failures. But compared to what might have been, compared to the totalitarian visions that had torn Europe apart, the American presence represented something revolutionary, the possibility of peace built on prosperity rather than just the absence of war. The Czech citizens of Pilsen erected monuments to their American liberators, statues and plaques, thanking the Third Army for reaching them first, for bringing freedom before the Iron Curtain could descend. These monuments would be torn down when the communists took power, then quietly rebuilt after 1989, when the Cold War ended and Czech democracy was restored. The cycle of construction and destruction and reconstruction told its own story about the forces that shaped post-war Europe, about the long shadow cast by those final days of May 1945, when the question of who arrived first mattered more than anyone at the time fully understood. Patton himself would not live to see the Cold War fully develop. He died in December 1945 after a car accident in occupied Germany, his warnings about Soviet expansion still ringing in ears that were not quite ready to listen. But his race to the Czech border, his insistence on driving east as far and fast as possible, proved prophetic. The line where American forces stopped became, with minor adjustments, the Iron Curtain. The people living west of that line rebuilt under the Marshall Plan and became prosperous democracies. The people living east of that line endured decades of Soviet domination. Patton had tried to push that line further east, had tried to liberate more territory before politics froze the map. He failed, but not for lack of effort or speed. The story of Patton reaching the Czech border first is not just a military anecdote. It is a parable about the collision between two ways of organizing human society, two visions of what nations could be, and how power should work. Hitler's scream in the bunker was not merely frustration at a tactical defeat. It was existential rage at being proven wrong about everything that mattered to him. Wrong about racial superiority. Wrong about democratic weakness. Wrong about American character. Wrong about the arc of history bending toward his 1,000-year Reich. The American soldiers who won that race, who planted their flags in Czech soil and liberated cities and distributed chocolate bars to children, did not think of themselves as historical figures or ideological warriors. They thought of themselves as men doing a dirty job that needed doing, counting the days until they could go home. But their victory, their speed, their sheer material abundance delivered a message that resonated far beyond the battlefield. It said that free societies could be powerful. It said that prosperity was not a zero-sum game where some must starve so others can feast. It said that the future belonged not to those who glorified war, but to those who understood it as a temporary necessity, something to be won quickly and left behind. And in the end, standing in the rubble of his bunker, as the world he built collapsed around him, Hitler understood this too. Understood it in the moment when he heard that Patton had reached the border, that American tanks were rolling through Czech streets, that the army he had dismissed as soft and mongrel had outfought, outproduced, and outlasted everything he could throw at them. The scream was not strategic analysis. It was the sound of a broken worldview, of an ideology colliding with reality and shattering into fragments that no amount of will or rage could reassemble. The symbolic C-ration can, preserved in museums and private collections, stands as a humble monument to that victory. Not to military genius or technological superiority alone, but to something more fundamental. The power of a system that could produce enough for everyone, that saw abundance as normal and waste as affordable, that treated its soldiers as citizens and its citizens as individuals worth preserving. Hitler built an empire on blood and soil and racial mythology. America built its power on factories and farms, and the radical idea that ordinary people, given freedom and opportunity, could accomplish extraordinary things. When the last shot was fired and the last surrender signed, when the American soldiers finally began their long journey home across the Atlantic, they left behind a Europe that had learned hard lessons about what happens when evil is allowed to flourish unchecked. But they also left behind something else, proof that democratic nations, for all their arguing and inefficiency and chaos, could mobilize overwhelming power when necessary, could fight wars and win them, could occupy former enemies without becoming oppressors themselves. This was the real message of Patton's race to Czechoslovakia, the true meaning of Hitler's scream in the bunker. Freedom, it turned out, was not weak. Abundance was not decadence. Democracy was not disorder. These things were strengths, formidable and real, backed by the productivity of millions of free people working toward common goals without coercion. The Americans who reached the Czech border first, in May 1945, carried this truth in their C-rations and their tank columns, in their casual confidence and their impatience to finish the job and go home. They were not a master race. They were something more dangerous to tyrants. They were ordinary people who had built an extraordinary system, and they had brought that system with them to Europe. One chocolate bar and one liberated city at a time. The dawn that rose over Pilsen on May 6, 1945, revealed a world transformed. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. The army that was supposed to conquer had been conquered. The ideology that promised strength had delivered only destruction. And rolling through the streets of an ancient Czech city, engines rumbling and treads clanking on cobblestones, came the proof that a different way was possible. Imperfect, yes, but functional in ways that totalitarian dreams could never be. Hitler's scream faded into silence, into history, into a cautionary tale about the price of mistaking brutality for strength and ideology for truth. But the lesson of Patton's arrival at the Czech border, the message carried by those American soldiers in their Sherman tanks, endured. It said that civilization was stronger than barbarism, that freedom was more powerful than slavery, that a people united by shared ideals rather than shared blood could move mountains, or at least could cross continents, defeat empires, and then go home to build the future rather than mourn the past. This was the truth Hitler could not accept, the reality that broke him more completely than any military defeat. And this was the legacy that shaped the world, which emerged from the rubble of his fallen Reich, a world where the American flag, flying over Pilsen in May 1945, marked not just the end of one war, but the beginning of a peace built on principles Hitler had dismissed as weakness, principles that proved, in the end, to be the only strength that mattered, that